you can have less files and smaller files. You don't really need 8 fonts and 37 tracking scripts. And then what everyone wants to know is, how do I actually make my website load faster? So I've got a few kind of principles, a few things to share here. Number one, smaller is faster. This is actually the only thing you need to verify as valid HTML to have, a page that exists. This obviously isn't a very useful page. But my point is that you can have less files and smaller files. You don't really need 8 fonts and 37 tracking scripts. And the way that typically CMS systems work is monolithic, which means you have every single JavaScript and CSS needed for every single function and style on literally every single page on the website, and then you don't really use half of that. That's not a great practice, because you're not using the things on the page, so you can kind of cut those down. And then just smaller JS files, smaller CSS files, smaller font files. If you look at this, I think this was a news website. This is what's called a request map, and it's basically all the different things that are loading, and some of those are loading other things, and some of the things that were loaded by the thing are loading other things. Like, it gets really complex, and suddenly you have like several hundred things involved in loading to get a usable page. So I would say, get rid of things, make them smaller. Images, figure out, do you even need it? Like, is that, or like a video, do you really want to play that video on mobile at all? CSS, remove unused CSS, minify CSS. Fonts, you can use system fonts over custom fonts. It doesn't even have to load a font. I think this PowerPoint's built in Arial. It's not a bad looking font. You can use it. Then JavaScript is going to be, removing unused JavaScript, minifying the JavaScript. And HTML, you can also minify or compress the HTML. So smaller, less things. Then number 2, location matters. You want to use a CDN when you can, mostly because users are going to be in different locations. CDNs are all over the world. You basically have a copy of your website on the CDN that is going to be closer to users. So if you look at the connection time that's here, that's highlighted, that's all the time to kind of connect, resolve the DNS, connect to the server, figure out the SSL. If you're closer, it's going to be faster. And you can also use the same server, if you can anyway. So it's not just your website that it has to connect to. When you're connecting to other things like Google Fonts, every single thing is going to be an additional connection. If we hosted that font ourselves, we would completely eliminate that connection time. Same with the JavaScript and CSS files. So host on your own server if you possibly can. Then there's other things like pre-connect, DNS prefetch. These just kind of start the connections earlier. If you look versus the other slides, instead of waiting until after the HTML is loaded, this is actually goes ahead and start loading it while the HTML is still being processed. So it just starts the connections a little bit earlier, gets you a little bit extra. And then there's caching. This is huge, actually. Pay attention to caching. Even if you have a really bad first load of a website, as long as all of the files that you're loading are stored, the second load basically needs very few things in comparison to actually load the page, the second page. So if people browse multiple pages on your website, this is going to be great for your metrics. But generally, you want the first load to be as fast as you can also. AMP even has a little cheat built in, kind of. They start loading while you're still on the Google search page. So those top stories I mentioned earlier, when you click and you go to one of them, it looks pretty much instant because, well, they sort of already loaded most of the stuff in the background. Now you can actually do this with any site. They have what are called signed exchanges. Cloudflare has this literally at the click of a button now, Cloudflare being one of the CDNs. You can activate it for your site and kind of get the same exact benefits. Pretty amazing. Then we have the last concept, which is prioritization of resources. This is probably the most important part, especially for solving LCP, largest contentful paint. And the goal is basically load things people see first and then load all the other things. It's basically reprioritizing instead of that waterfall that's like, let me get this and this and this and this and blah, 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 blah. It's like, let me get the most important things that are actually going to load all the content above the fold, the fonts I need, the styles I need, the JavaScript or images I need, get all that, and then load everything else that's needed later in the page, or functions, like if I need to click a chat thing to pop up a chat box, load that later. You don't have to load it immediately. So it's a little change in traditional loading that makes things faster. Images early, again, like get rid of an image if you can, but if you can't, preload it. This is the easiest way to do it. Preload any of the images that you have above the fold. It might be your logo. It could be, maybe a hero image of some kind. It's going to start loading it earlier. It just like we saw with pre-connect. It's basically saying, like, I'm going to need this, give it to me as soon as possible, set the browser priority to high, and get this to me ASAP. With CLS, like, you can also set the width and height of the images, which I mentioned. This is going to prevent any shifting. And then for images that come later, what you want to do is lazy load them. It's basically going to say, like, I don't need this now. Don't go ahead and start downloading it. Just wait till some other things happen and then load those images that I don't need immediately. With CSS early, what you want to do is inline critical CSS. And let me explain that real quick. It's basically taking some elements out of like your CSS document and moving them directly into the HTML. And what that means is your rendering can happen once it's downloaded that HTML rather than like waiting for the CSS file and then now things can happen. So it moves that render point back a bit.